January 17, 1944. Kwajalein Atoll, Marshall Islands. The horizon burns orange beneath a sky barely awake. The Pacific stretches infinite and indifferent, a liquid desert broken only by scattered emerald specks, islands so small they vanish from view when the swell rises. On one such speck, a Japanese naval officer stands at the edge of a concrete bunker, binoculars pressed to his face, scanning the empty sea. The air smells of salt and coral dust. Behind him, his men sleep in shifts, rifles stacked against sandbags, confident in what they know to be true. No enemy could leapfrog across these distances. No army could build what would be needed. The ocean itself is their fortress. He lowers the binoculars. Nothing. Just waves and wind and the eternal patience of the Empire. 72 hours later, American bulldozers would be carving runways into that same coral. 10 days after that, B-24 Liberators would be taking off from where he now stood, engines roaring toward targets he believed unreachable. He did not yet know he was watching the death of an assumption that had shaped Japanese naval strategy since 1941. He did not know that the impossible had already begun. In the autumn of 1943, American war planners faced a problem that seemed insurmountable by every conventional measure. The road to Tokyo stretched across 7,000 miles of open ocean, punctuated by hundreds of fortified islands, each one a potential killing ground. The Japanese had spent 2 decades fortifying this Pacific labyrinth, turning atolls into fortresses, transforming coral reefs into naval bastions. Their strategy was elegant in its simplicity: force the Americans to fight for every island, one bloody landing at a time. Attrition would do what battleships could not. The Americans would exhaust themselves against the vastness of the Pacific itself. The Japanese High Command had studied the logistics. They had done the mathematics. To sustain an offensive across such distances required airfields, not just captured airfields, but new ones, built where none existed. And building airfields took time. Months. Perhaps years. Time enough to reinforce. Time enough to counterattack. Time enough to bleed the Americans white before they ever reached the home islands. What the Japanese did not account for, what no military in history had truly accounted for, was the American Construction Battalion. The Seabees. Men who could turn ocean into runway, jungle into base, coral into concrete, and do it faster than any army could respond. Island hopping, the strategy that would shatter Japan's defensive perimeter and compress a 10-year war into 4, rested entirely on a promise that seemed absurd: that American engineers could build an operational airfield on a hostile island in less time than it took a Japanese destroyer to sail from truck to reinforce it. 10 days. Sometimes less. Build it while under fire. Build it on islands that had never seen a bulldozer. Build it faster than the enemy could comprehend. The Japanese believed this impossible. So did most of the American officer corps. The Seabees proved them both wrong, and in doing so, rewrote the grammar of modern warfare. The story begins not in the Pacific, but in the mind of Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, a man so abrasive that President Roosevelt once joked he was the only person in Washington who could start an argument in an empty room. In late 1941, in the rubble of Pearl Harbor's aftermath, King looked at the map of the Pacific and saw what others did not: that the key to victory was not ships or planes or even soldiers. It was time. Every day the Japanese held their island fortresses, they grew stronger. Every week the Americans spent planning an assault gave the enemy time to dig deeper, pour more concrete, and place more artillery. Traditional military construction moved at a peacetime pace. Civilian contractors required safety protocols, union negotiations, environmental surveys. The Army Corps of Engineers was brilliant but bureaucratic, bound by procedure and precedent. King needed something else. He needed construction workers who could fight. Soldiers who could build. Men who could operate a bulldozer under mortar fire, pour concrete while snipers took shots at them, string barbed wire with one hand and hold a rifle with the other. He needed an organization that did not yet exist. On December 28, 1941, 21 days after Pearl Harbor, the Navy authorized the formation of the Naval Construction Battalions. The name was bureaucratic and forgettable. The men who joined shortened it phonetically, Seabees. And they wore that name like armor. The Navy sent recruiters into lumber camps and oil fields, into quarries and construction sites, looking for men who knew how to move earth and pour concrete, who understood cranes and explosives, who had spent their lives building roads through mountains and bridges over rivers. They were not looking for young men. They wanted experience. Competence. The average age of a Seabee was 37. Many were in their 40s. Some in their 50s. Men with mortgages and families, men who had survived the Depression by knowing how to make something from nothing. The Navy gave them 6 weeks of boot camp, enough to teach them to march and salute, then issued them rifles and hammers and sent them to war. What happened next defied every assumption about military logistics that had held since Napoleon. February 1, 1944. The island of Roynamur, Northern Marshall Islands. The Marines have just secured the beachhead. The fighting is still sporadic, Japanese holdouts and bunkers, snipers in the ruins, the crack of rifle fire punctuating the humid afternoon. Smoke rises from shattered palm trees. The coral ground is torn and cratered from naval bombardment. Bodies lie unburied in the sun. Into this chaos drive the Seabees. They arrive in amphibious tractors, bulldozers chained to the decks, trucks loaded with steel matting and cement mixers, generators and drilling equipment. They do not wait for the island to be declared secure. They do not wait for the engineers to survey the terrain, or the planners to approve the blueprints. They roll off the landing craft and get to work. Within an hour, bulldozers are scraping coral, leveling bomb craters, pushing shattered palm trunks into piles. The noise is apocalyptic. The roar of diesel engines, the grinding of steel blades on coral rock, the intermittent pop of small arms fire as Marines clear the remaining bunkers 50 yards away. The Seabees work in shifts, 24 hours a day. Floodlights at night, silhouetting them against the darkness, making them perfect targets. They work anyway. By the second day, the outline of a runway emerges. By the fourth day, they are pouring concrete. By the seventh day, the first transport plane lands, carrying fuel and ammunition and medical supplies. By the 10th day, B-24 bombers are taking off, heading northwest to pound Japanese positions in the Caroline Islands. 10 days. From contested beachhead to operational airbase. From jungle and coral to a runway capable of handling 4-engine bombers. A Japanese naval officer, captured on a nearby island, is shown aerial photographs of Roynamur. He studies them in silence, then asks through a translator when the photographs were taken. He is told, 14 days after the American landing. He shakes his head. Impossible, he says. You are showing me photographs from different islands. No force could build this in 14 days. We calculated it would take 6 months minimum. The translator assures him. Same island. 10 days of construction. The officer says nothing more. But something shifts in his expression. Not anger. Not even surprise. Something closer to comprehension. The slow, sickening realization that his entire strategic framework has been rendered obsolete. The secret, if it could be called that, was not in technology. It was in philosophy. The Seabees did not build like an army. They built like a construction crew facing a deadline with penalty clauses. They cut every corner that did not compromise function. They improvised solutions faster than problems could be identified. They worked with a speed born not from discipline but from culture, the culture of American construction in the 1930s, where a skyscraper went up in a year and a dam spanned a canyon in 5. Take the runway itself. Traditional military airfield construction required deep excavation, compacted gravel base layers, multiple pours of reinforced concrete, weeks of curing time. The Seabees looked at the coral atolls and saw a different possibility. Coral, when crushed and compacted, formed a base nearly as hard as concrete. They developed a technique, bulldoze the coral flat, compact it with heavy rollers, lay down steel matting, interlocking plates of pierced steel planking that could be bolted together like a giant jigsaw puzzle, and you had a functional runway. Not pretty. Not permanent. But operational in a fraction of the time. The steel matting itself was an innovation born from necessity. Marston Mat, named after the North Carolina town where it was first tested, was ugly and utilitarian, perforated steel plates, each 10 feet long and 15 inches wide, with holes punched through to reduce weight and allow drainage. But it could be unrolled like a carpet, bolted together by hand, and within hours you had a surface capable of handling the weight of a fully loaded bomber. In the mud of New Guinea, the sand of the Gilberts, the coral of the Marshalls, Marston Mat turned swamps and beaches into airfields. The Seabees laid thousands of miles of it. They became so efficient that they could lay matting faster than the planes could land on it. But speed alone was not enough. The Pacific presented challenges no construction crew had ever faced. Islands with no fresh water, where every drop had to be distilled from seawater. Islands with no harbors, where equipment had to be offloaded directly onto beaches through surf and coral reefs. Islands under constant threat of air attack, where construction had to be done under blackout conditions or in the brief windows between Japanese bombing runs. The Seabees adapted. They built pontoon causeways to bridge the gap between ship and shore. They developed floating drydocs that could be towed across the Pacific and assembled in open water. They designed portable distillation units that could turn seawater into drinking water at a rate of 10,000 gallons per day. They learned to work in shifts so seamless that the bulldozers never stopped, day or night, one driver climbing down as another climbed up, the machine still moving. And they learned to fight. June 1944. Saipan, Mariana Islands. The Seabees are building a bomber base on the southern end of the island when Japanese forces launch a counterattack. It is night. The floodlights are on, illuminating the construction site, making it visible for miles. The Japanese come out of the jungle in a banzai charge, hundreds of them, screaming, bayonets fixed, desperate to destroy the airfield before it becomes operational. The Seabees drop their tools and pick up their rifles. They are not Marines. They have not trained for this. But they are Americans who grew up hunting deer in Michigan and ducks in Louisiana, who learned to shoot before they learned to shave. They form a defensive line along the construction site, and they fire. Steady. Disciplined. The way you clear a forest or lay a foundation, one task at a time, done right. The Japanese charge breaks against them like water against stone. When dawn comes, the bodies lie in heaps at the edge of the runway. The Seabees count their casualties, 12 dead, 30 wounded, then return to work. By noon, the bulldozers are running again. This becomes a pattern across the Pacific. At Guadalcanal, Seabees hold a defensive line for 3 days while the Marines regroup. At Peleliu, they defuse Japanese mines while under sniper fire. At Iwo Jima, they land on D-Day with the assault waves, not to fight but to begin clearing the beach for the vehicles and supplies that will follow. 600 Seabees land on Iwo Jima in the first 72 hours. 99 are killed. The survivors keep building. There is a photograph from Iwo Jima, taken on D-Day +3. It shows a Seabee operating a bulldozer on the beach, pushing sand to widen the road inland. In the foreground, half buried in the volcanic ash, is the body of a Japanese soldier. The bulldozer is 10 feet away, still moving. The Seabee's face is expressionless. Not cruel. Not triumphant. Just focused. There is work to be done. That photograph, more than any strategic analysis, captures what the Japanese faced. An enemy that would not stop. That could not be exhausted. That would build while you shot at them, and when you killed them, more would come, and the building would continue, relentless as a tide. The strategic implications were staggering. Before the Seabees, island hopping was a theory. With the Seabees, it became reality. The Americans could bypass the strongest Japanese fortresses, leap over them to weaker islands, build airfields, and use those airfields to isolate the fortresses they had bypassed. The Japanese garrisons on Truk, on Rabaul, on dozens of smaller islands, found themselves cut off, their supply lines strangled, their artillery useless. They could see American planes flying overhead, heading to targets beyond, and there was nothing they could do. The mathematics of attrition reversed. Instead of the Americans bleeding out against fortified positions, the Japanese starved in place, their guns silent, their men wasting from disease and hunger. Entire divisions surrendered without firing a shot, not because they were cowards, but because they had been rendered strategically irrelevant. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had warned his superiors that Japan could not win a long war against America. He had visited the United States in the 1920s, had seen the factories and the farms, the oil fields and the shipyards. He knew what American industry could do. But even Yamamoto, in his darkest assessments, had not imagined this, that the Americans would not just outproduce Japan, but outbuild them on hostile islands, under fire, faster than the Japanese could respond. There is a recorded conversation, intercepted by American intelligence in late 1944, between two Japanese officers discussing the fall of the Marianas. One of them says, "We calculated they would need 6 months to make Saipan operational. They did it in 28 days. How do you fight an enemy that builds faster than you can destroy?" The other officer has no answer. By the summer of 1945, the Seabees had built over 400 airfields across the Pacific. Not captured and repaired. Built from nothing. On islands that had no roads, no infrastructure, no ports. They had constructed hospitals and fuel depots, bridges and breakwaters, docks and dry docks. They had moved mountains, literally, using explosives to level terrain, reshape coastlines, create harbors where none existed. On Okinawa alone, they built 8 airfields in 90 days, while the battle for the island was still raging. Japanese artillery shelled the construction sites daily. Kamikaze planes targeted the supply ships. The Seabees kept building. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, those bombs were delivered by B-29 superfortresses flying from airfields in the Marianas, airfields built by Seabees in the summer of 1944, on islands the Japanese had believed invulnerable. The Japanese surrender came on September 2, 1945. Among the first Americans to land in Japan were the Seabees. They came ashore at Yokosuka, surveyed the naval base, and began planning repairs. Within weeks, they had transformed the shattered port into an operational facility capable of handling the American occupation fleet. The speed, by now, was routine. A Japanese civilian, watching the Americans work, asked a translator how long the Seabees had been in the Navy. The translator explained, 3 years. Some less. The civilian shook his head. In Japan, he said, it takes 10 years to train a master builder. You have created an army of them in 3. The translator thought about this, then replied, in America, we have always built fast. We just did not know we could build this fast until we had to. There is a symbolic object that appears again and again in the accounts of those who witnessed the Seabees' work, the Quonset hut. It was not beautiful. It was not designed to last centuries. It was a half-cylinder of corrugated steel, bolted to a concrete slab, ugly as a culvert pipe and twice as utilitarian. But it could be erected in a single day by 6 men with wrenches. It was waterproof, fireproof, and could withstand typhoon winds. Inside, it could be a barracks, a warehouse, a hospital, a headquarters. The Seabees built thousands of them. Tens of thousands. To the Japanese soldiers who saw them rising across the Pacific, the Quonset hut became a symbol of something they could not articulate but could not ignore: American abundance. Not wealth in the aristocratic sense. Abundance in the industrial sense. The ability to produce so much, so fast, that even temporary structures were built to a standard that exceeded Japan's permanent facilities. There are accounts of Japanese prisoners of war being held in Seabee-built compounds, staring at the electric lights, the plumbing, the screened windows, the ice machines that produced cold drinks in the tropics. One prisoner, asked what he thought of the American base, said to a translator, "We were told you were soft. We were told you could not endure hardship. But you have brought your entire country with you. You do not endure the jungle. You erase it." That observation, made in confusion and exhaustion, cuts to the heart of what the Seabees represented. They were not just builders. They were the physical manifestation of a different kind of power, not the power to conquer, but the power to transform. To take a hostile environment and remake it in the image of American capability. To impose order on chaos, infrastructure on wilderness, at a speed that felt almost supernatural. The Japanese had fought bravely. Their soldiers had endured starvation, disease, death with a discipline born from centuries of warrior culture. But courage and discipline could not stop a bulldozer. Bushido could not outpace a construction schedule. Spiritual strength could not prevent a runway from being built. The Seabees did not defeat Japan alone. But they made Japan's defeat inevitable. Because they proved that the Pacific was not a barrier. It was a construction site. And every island, no matter how remote, could be turned into a stepping stone. The only question was how fast. The answer was 10 days. Sometimes less. When the war ended, the Seabees returned home. They took off their uniforms and went back to building highways and bridges, dams and skyscrapers. Some stayed in the Navy. Most did not. They had done what they came to do. They had built a road across the Pacific, one island at a time, and at the end of that road was Tokyo Bay and a signed surrender. But the world they returned to had changed, in part because of what they had built. The techniques they developed, rapid construction, modular design, prefabricated components, heavy machinery adapted for combat zones, became standard in post-war infrastructure projects. The interstate highway system, the suburban housing boom, the expansion of American industry into every corner of the globe, all of it carried the fingerprints of lessons learned in the could not endure hardship. But you have brought your entire country with you. You do not endure the jungle. You erase it. That observation, made in confusion and exhaustion, cuts to the heart of what the Seabees represented. They were not just builders. They were the physical manifestation of a different kind of power, not the power to conquer, but the power to transform. To take a hostile environment and remake it in the image of American capability. To impose order on chaos, infrastructure on wilderness, at a speed that felt almost supernatural. The Japanese had fought bravely. Their soldiers had endured starvation, disease, death with a discipline born from centuries of warrior culture. But courage and discipline could not stop a bulldozer. Bushido could not outpace a construction schedule. Spiritual strength could not prevent a runway from being built. The Seabees did not defeat Japan alone. But they made Japan's defeat inevitable. Because they proved that the Pacific was not a barrier. It was a construction site. And every island, no matter how remote, could be turned into a stepping stone. The only question was how fast. The answer was 10 days. Sometimes less. When the war ended, the Seabees returned home. They took off their uniforms and went back to building highways and bridges, dams and skyscrapers. Some stayed in the Navy. Most did not. They had done what they came to do. They had built a road across the Pacific, one island at a time, and at the end of that road was Tokyo Bay and a signed surrender. But the world they returned to had changed, in part because of what they had built. The techniques they developed, rapid construction, modular design, prefabricated components, heavy machinery adapted for combat zones, became standard in post-war infrastructure projects. The interstate highway system, the suburban housing boom, the expansion of American industry into every corner of the globe, all of it carried the fingerprints of lessons learned in the Pacific. Speed. Efficiency. Scale. The Seabees had shown that the impossible was just a deadline no one had bothered to meet yet. There is a memorial at Arlington National Cemetery, a simple bronze plaque dedicated to the Seabees who died in World War II. It lists the battles: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. But it does not list the airfields. It does not mention the runways or the roads or the hospitals. It does not quantify the tonnage of concrete poured or the miles of steel matting laid. And perhaps that is fitting. Because the Seabees were never about monuments. They were about function. About getting the job done. About making the impossible routine. There is a story, probably apocryphal, about a Seabee battalion commander addressing his men before a landing. He tells them that intelligence estimates the island will take 3 weeks to secure and 6 months to develop into an operational base. He pauses, looks at the men, and says, "We land in the morning? I expect a runway by Wednesday." And they built one. That, more than any battle or any speech or any analysis, is the truth of what the Seabees accomplished. They redefined possible. Not through propaganda or doctrine, but through work. Hard, unglamorous, relentless work. The kind of work that does not make headlines but wins wars. The Japanese believed island hopping was impossible because they calculated the time required and concluded no army could move that fast. They were right. No army could. But the Seabees were not an army. They were builders who learned to fight, not fighters who learned to build. And that distinction, small as it seems, meant everything. Because in the end, the war in the Pacific was not won by the side with the most courage or the best tactics or the strongest fortifications. It was won by the side that could build an airfield in 10 days, under fire, on an island that had never seen concrete, and do it so routinely that it stopped being remarkable. The Japanese had built their strategy on the assumption that the ocean was an ally. That distance was a weapon. That time was on their side. The Seabees proved them wrong. Not with speeches. Not with slogans. But with bulldozers and steel matting and concrete that dried faster than the enemy could believe. And when it was over, when the surrender was signed and the guns fell silent, the most devastating question was not about battles lost or fleets destroyed. It was the question that Japanese officer had asked, staring at photographs of Roynummer: how do you fight an enemy that builds faster than you can destroy? The answer, of course, is that you don't. You can't. You surrender. And you try to understand what kind of nation could produce men who would land on a hostile beach and, before the shooting stopped, start building a runway. That was the final lesson of the Seabees. Not that America had more resources, though it did. Not that it had better technology, though it did. But that it had a culture that believed the impossible was just another job. Another deadline. Another project. And if you gave Americans the tools and got out of their way, they would build anything. Anywhere. In 10 days or less. The Pacific was not conquered. It was paved. And the men who paved it went home and built the world we live in now. That is the epilogue. That is the inheritance. Every road you drive on, every bridge you cross, every building you enter, somewhere in its genealogy is the lesson learned on a coral atoll in 1944, when men with bulldozers proved that distance and time and the ocean itself were not obstacles. They were just materials. Waiting to be shaped. Waiting to be built. 10 days. Sometimes less. Fast enough to change the world.